In the thin, perpetual twilight of Martian ruin Sector 4, where the rust-red dunes stretched like the frozen waves of a petrified ocean, Dolothar knelt in the dust. The archaeologist's broad, scaled hands, each of the 4 fingers tipped with a retractable claw, sifted through layers of regolith, exposing fragments of what the universe had long dismissed as inconsequence. Dolothar was no mere scavenger of relics. He was the preeminent surveyor of the Zyrian Historical Institute, tasked with cataloging the detritus of civilizations that had flickered and died across the galaxy's periphery. The Zyri, his people, prided themselves on their unbroken lineage, a million years of deliberate, hierarchical progress, their archives meticulously ordered, their societal edifice unmarred by the chaotic upheavals that had extinguished lesser species. Martian ruins. Sector 4 was supposed to be a footnote, a scattering of eroded monoliths and shallow craters, attributed to some long-extinct protoculture incapable of achieving stellar migration. The prevailing scholarly consensus held that no species had ever established a foothold on this world before the great exodus of the later stellar empires. Certainly not the humans, those brutish, short-lived mammals whose final remnants had collapsed into barbarism on their own dying planet 19,000 years prior. Humans were the exemplar of primitive failure in Zyrian textbooks, a species that had grasped the rudiments of fusion propulsion and planetary engineering, only to squander it all in fratricidal wars, environmental collapse, and self-inflicted genetic decay. Their diaspora had been a ragged scattering of colony outposts, most of which had withered without successors. The survivors, huddled in fortified enclaves, were pitied as living fossils, proof of what happened when a species lacked the discipline to transcend its biological frailties. Dolothar had never shared that unreserved contempt. He had studied the human archaeological record there, sprawling libraries of compressed data, their machines that could reshape worlds in mere decades, and sensed a tenacity that defied easy dismissal. But here, in the shadow of a fractured basalt ridge, he confronted evidence that would unravel the galaxy's tidy narrative. The first indication came without fanfare. A routine seismic probe, deployed to map subsurface voids, returned anomalous density readings, a lattice of artificial cavities extending 2 kilometers beneath the regolith. Excavation began under the harsh glare of portable fusion lamps, their blue-white radiance cutting through the perpetual haze of suspended iron oxide. Dolothar's Team 6 Zyrian technicians, 2 Voron gravimetric specialists, and a complement of semi-autonomous dig drones worked in disciplined silence, their exosuits hissing softly with each adjustment of internal pressure. The air recyclers hummed against the omnipresent whine of electrostatic discharge, and the faint, omnipresent scent of ozone clung to their filtration masks dotted a depth of 87 meters. The drills breached a pressurized vault. Not a natural bubble, nor the half-collapsed shell of some later colonial effort, but a deliberate enclosure, walls of carbon polymer composite, still retaining 73% of their original structural integrity after uncounted millennia. The interior was a mausoleum. Thousands of skeletal remains lay in ordered rows, encased in translucent sarcophagi that had resisted the planet's corrosive atmosphere. Many were intact, their bones unmarred by the desiccation that should have pulverized them. Dolothar moved among the ranks of the dead, his helmet lamp sweeping across the tableau. The skeletons were unmistakably human, bipedal, 5-fingered extremities, narrow cranial vaults with prominent brow ridges. No augmentations, no cranial reservoirs, no skeletal reinforcements, no symbiotic implants distinguished them from the baseline fossils recovered from Earth's own stratigraphic layers. These were pure, unaugmented Homo sapiens. Yet the context defied orthodoxy. Radiometric assays, cross-referenced with isotopic decay chains, yielded an unambiguous verdict. The vault had been sealed approximately 3.72 million years ago. Not 19,000 years. Not even 100,000, millions. The author stood motionless amid the silent ranks, the weight of the revelation pressing against the confines of his suit. The implications cascaded through his thoughts like a breached data cascade. Every galactic historical model placed the first verified instances of interstellar travel primitive, sublite arc ships at roughly 1 million years before present. The Zyri themselves had achieved it 800,000 years ago. No species was credited with the sustained engineering capacity for extrasolar colonization prior to that threshold. And yet here was irrefutable evidence of deliberate, large-scale settlement on Mars, predating all known benchmarks by an order of magnitude. He activated his suit's command channel. "Crusher," he said to his primary assistant, a meticulous cataloger with a penchant for exhaustive verification. "Initiate full stratigraphic profiling. Every grain of regolith displaced from this excavation must be assayed for chronological markers. Cross-reference with orbital spectrometry." Crusher's response came without inflection, as was his habit. "Understood, survey leader. But the implications of the primary dating, they contradict the established temporal framework." "They do," Delauthor replied. "And that is precisely why we must verify beyond doubt." As the team deployed a cordon of sensor pylons and began extracting samples for DNA reconstruction, Delauthor lingered in the vault. He approached one of the better-preserved sarcophagi, its occupant a male in late skeletal maturity, arms crossed over a ribcage marked by healed fractures. The skull gazed upward through empty sockets, teeth clenched in a rictus that suggested neither agony nor repose. Delauthor traced a claw along the translucent barrier, noting the faint etchings of deliberate script glyphs that matched no known human language from the later historical record. What manner of species could dispatch an armada capable of emplacing this vault, then vanish so utterly that their achievement was scrubbed from every subsequent chronicle? Not a collapse, surely. The precision of the interment argued for forethought, not catastrophe. And yet the absence of any supporting infrastructure, no orbital docks, no fusion reactor remnants, no beacon arrays suggested a withdrawal as methodical as the initial arrival. Hours later, sequestered in the cramped forward compartment of the expedition's primary lander, Delauthor reviewed the first wave of analytical results. The DNA reconstruction, extrapolated from mitochondrial and nuclear fragments preserved in the bone matrix, confirmed human origin without ambiguity. No chimeric modifications, no alien engineering. Pure genomic continuity with the species, known to have perished on Earth, but the age of the remains, the synchronized terminus of cellular senescence aligned precisely with the vault's closure. These colonists had arrived, built their sanctuary, and died within a span of mere generations, their bodies carefully arranged for posterity. Delauthor leaned back in his restraint harness, the lander's recycled air heavy with the tang of overworked scrubbers. The galaxy's historians had labeled humanity primitive because their recorded civilization had been a brief, turbulent spark, a species that had touched the stars, only to fall back into a dark age from which they had barely begun to emerge. But these bones older than the Zyri's own primordial wars, older than the crystalline archives of the Vorath Concord, spoke of a different story. A story of audacity that had reached across a gulf of time and left no echo. He keyed the secure transmission array. Addressing the Institute's central archive on Zyre Prime, the message would take 3 hours to traverse the relay lattice, but its contents would demand immediate review. As he composed the preliminary report, a faint unease coiled in his midgut. The vault was not merely anomalous. It was foundational. If humanity had colonized Mars, millions of years before any other species had solved the equations of sustained extrasolar habitation, then the edifice of galactic history, its hierarchies of advancement, its contempt for the primitive rested on fractured ground, and somewhere beneath the regolith, in vaults yet unbreached, the dead waited for their secrets to be exhumed. Secrets that would force even the most disciplined minds to question whether humanity had ever truly been the lesser branch on the tree of civilizations. The days following the discovery of the primary vault stretched into a relentless cycle of excavation and analysis. Each shift marked by the rhythmic thud of drill probes boring through regolith and the ceaseless drone of sensor arrays recalibrating their grids. Delauthor directed his team with the precision of a conductor marshalling a discordant orchestra, but beneath the ordered surface of their work, doubt began to erode the foundation of their certainty. The primary vault had been a revelation, but it was also an enigma, a tomb without a city, a colony without its scaffolding. To resolve the contradiction, they needed evidence of the civilization that had built it. Crusher voiced the prevailing skepticism during a briefing in the lander's command module. His voice filtered through the hiss of his suit communicator. The vault demonstrates capacity for interplanetary transport and cryogenic preservation. Survey leader, but it is a single datum. A single expeditionary force, perhaps an outlier, not a sustained presence. Without evidence of supporting infrastructure, we risk extrapolating a civilization from what may have been a temporary military or scientific venture. Delauthor regarded the holographic projection of the vault's stratigraphic profile. A lattice of chambers embedded like the chambers of a heart in the planet's crust. A temporary venture does not seal its participants in ordered sarcophagi spanning multiple generations, he countered. Nor does it etch inscriptions in a script that defies all subsequent human linguistic evolution. We excavate outward. The decision provoked murmurs among the team. The Voran specialists, with their innate aversion to committing resources to unproven hypotheses, argued for halting the primary dig and requesting orbital reinforcement. But Delauthor overrode them, reallocating the full complement of drones and seismic cutters to a radial survey. What they uncovered in the subsequent weeks dismantled the notion of a fleeting incursion. The first subsidiary chambers lay a mere 4 kilometers distant, connected to the primary vault by a network of collapsed transit tunnels. Breaching the outermost seal revealed a complex that dwarfed the mausoleum in scale and ambition, a subterranean metropolis. Its corridors lined with conduits that had once circulated liquid metal plasma for thermal regulation. Its bulkheads reinforced with a titanium diamond composite unknown to any later human industrial base. Automated fabrication halls stood frozen in time, their molecular assemblers containing feedstock reservoirs, still partially filled with raw carbon nanotubes and isotopic fuels. Power distribution manifolds, each capable of sustaining a city of 10 million. Radiated outward in a fractal pattern, their superconducting coils unruptured by the passage of eons. As the excavation expanded, the sheer volume of infrastructure forced a re-evaluation. Kilometers of habitation modules, hydroponic spheres with desiccated root matrices, and electromagnetic rail accelerators capable of launching payloads to escape velocity without chemical propellant emerged from the regolith. One chamber alone contained a fusion reactor core, its toroidal containment field generator intact, its fuel pellet injectors loaded with a deuterium-tritium mix that radiometric analysis dated to the same epoch, 3.72 million years past. The reactor had been decommissioned in a controlled shutdown, its plasma exhaust vents sealed with deliberate precision. Delauthor walked the corridors of this buried city alone during the rest cycles, his helmet lamps casting stark shadows across walls inscribed with the same untranslatable script. The air recyclers in his suit struggled to filter the pervasive mustiness of vacuum-preserved decay, the faint, metallic reek of oxidized polymers, and the dry, papery scent of desiccated organics. He paused in what had been a central assembly hall, its vaulted ceiling supported by ribs of foamed regolith 40 meters overhead. Thousands could have stood here, shoulder to shoulder, their voices echoing off the unyielding stone. The scale of it, of building an entire world beneath another world pressed against him like the weight of the kilometers of earth above. Yet for all its grandeur, the city was empty. No bodies littered the corridors, no signs of conflict scarred the walls. Furniture remained in place, articulated benches sized for human frames, control consoles with 5-fingered haptic interfaces, data crystals slotted into racks that spanned entire chambers. The inhabitants had departed or been evacuated with a thoroughness that bordered on ritual. Delother traced a gloved hand over a console's input array, its surface unmarred by dust. As if the last operator had risen from their station and simply walked away, the team's unease coalesced around this absence. During a strategy session, Voron specialist Mirith voiced what many were thinking. "This is no abandoned colony," she said, her multifaceted eyes reflecting the glow of the central holodisplay. "The level of preparation, the systematic decommissioning of every power source, the absence of decay gradients suggests a planned withdrawal. But to where? And why leave no trace in any orbital record?" Crusher, ever the archivist, added a colder assessment. "If this complex represents a sustained human presence, predating all known instances of interstellar travel by millions of years, then where are the other settlements? Where are the ships? The archives? Every civilization leaves behind a debris field, orbital wrecks, beacon relays, abandoned outposts. There is nothing." Delother listened without interruption, his mind turning over the contradiction. The evidence was overwhelming. Humanity had not merely visited Mars, but colonized it on a scale that rivaled the greatest later empires. Yet the completeness of their erasure defied comprehension. It was as if they had struck their tents, extinguished their fires, and erased their footprints from the sands of time. That night, in the narrow confines of his bunk alcove, Delother activated a private data slate and reviewed the fragmentary inscriptions recovered from the habitation modules. The script was agglutinative, its syntax resistant to standard decryption algorithms. But certain repeated motifs emerged, concentric rings enclosing a central nexus, a stylized helix entwined with a fractured orbital path. One panel, preserved in a sealed data reliquary, depicted a procession of figures departing a planetary silhouette, their outlines dissolving into a radiant boundary beyond the system's edge. He set the slate aside and stared into the dimness of his compartment, the faint hum of the lander's life support systems underscoring the silence. For the first time, the possibility crystallized in his thoughts. These humans had not merely survived on Mars, they had conquered it, built there, and then abandoned it by choice. Not through defeat or disaster, but through some act of will that required them to forsake every material trace of their presence. The realization carried an undercurrent of disquiet. The Zairi prided themselves on permanence. Their archives were redundant across a dozen worlds, their cultural monuments engineered to outlast their parent star. To build on such a scale, only to relinquish it entirely, suggested a form of resolve or faith that transcended the imperatives of survival. What manner of belief, what certainty of purpose, would compel a people to wipe themselves from the ledger of a world they had made their own? As the excavation drones hummed onward into the uncharted depths, piercing stratum after stratum of buried human ambition, Delother found himself wondering if the true measure of a civilization lay not in the monuments it left behind, but in the reasons it chose to leave none. And then, at the heart of the complex, the drones uncovered a chamber sealed behind a lock that had defied every automated bypass. Its single-access hatch bore an inscription that, for the first time, yielded to partial translation, a warning. Unequivocal and absolute, do not follow. The warning inscribed on the central chamber's access hatch gleamed under the harsh illumination of the excavation lamps. Its partially translated characters stark against the polished alloy of the hatch. Do not follow. The words hung in the thin atmosphere of the dig site, transmitted through the team's suit communicators, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The phrase was not an entreaty or a plea. but a declaration cold, final, and devoid of ambiguity. It was the first complete sentence the team had wrested from the otherwise impenetrable script, and its implications rippled through the assembled researchers like a seismic aftershock. Delauthor stood before the sealed portal, its surface unmarred by the eons, as if time itself had been commanded to withdraw. The hatch was a monolith, 12 meters high, fabricated from a self-repairing metamaterial that had resisted every probe's attempt at molecular sampling. No locks, no manual overrides, no visible control interfaces, only the inscription, repeated in 3 concentric bands around its circumference. The team's most advanced intrusion algorithms had failed. Their recursive decryption, halted by cascading false trail encryption that consumed computational cycles without yielding progress. "We cannot leave it sealed," Delauthor said at last, his voice cutting through the taut silence. "To retreat now, without understanding the directive it seeks to enforce, is to abandon the very purpose of our mandate. Whatever lies beyond this hatch is the fulcrum of this entire complex." Crusher's response was immediate and precise. "The directive is explicit. Breaching it risks contaminating or destroying evidence that may be deliberately preserved. If this chamber contains data, strategic, technical, or otherwise, it may be protected precisely because it is intended to remain inaccessible." The debate that followed exposed the first true fracture in the team's unity. Mirath, the Voran gravimetrist, advocated for petitioning the Institute for a full expeditionary charter, including specialist decryption arrays capable of cracking the hatch's defenses. Others argued for more aggressive measures, shaped plasma charges, quantum tunneling emitters, even disassembly of the surrounding structure. Delauthor listened, weighing their words against the compulsion that had driven him to this forsaken world. The city, the vast silent edifice of human ambition, demanded answers. To turn back now was to accept ignorance as a boundary dot in the end. He authorized a hybrid approach, a surgical assault on the hatch's molecular lattice, using a synchronized array of neutrino disruptors to map and destabilize the metamaterial self-repair protocols without causing catastrophic failure. The operation consumed 3 solar days, during which the team worked in rotating shifts, their suits smeared with the residue of exhausted flux capacitors and the acrid tang of overheated field generators. When the hatch finally yielded, it did so without violence, a seamless iris dilation that admitted them into darkness. The chamber beyond was a vault unlike any other they had uncovered. It was a spherical enclosure, 300 meters in diameter. Its interior lined with concentric rings of data storage monoliths, each a flawless cylinder of quantum-entangled crystal, capable of preserving information at the Planck scale. At the chamber's core hung a single focal array, a holographic projection nexus, its emitters dormant, but structurally pristine. Thousands of monoliths radiated outward from this central node, connected by webs of optical conduits that had preserved their vacuum integrity. Lothar directed the deployment of portable data extractors, and the chamber awoke in fragments. The monoliths did not yield their contents willingly. Each required individual authentication through a cascade of cryptographic challenges that taxed the landers' auxiliary processors. But what emerged from the first successful extraction rewrote the scope of their understanding. The data were navigational charts not of the solar system, nor of the near-stellar neighborhood, but of a galactic-scale exodus. Hyperbolic trajectories, plotted with precision that exceeded any later astrogational standard, traced paths from Sol outward to a distributed array of 27 primary destinations. These were not tentative probes or colony arcs, but mass displacements, fleets comprising billions of individuals, propelled by drive systems that manipulated space-time curvature through paired gravitational singularities. The schematics revealed engines that no known human technology had replicated, warp envelopes sustained not by brute energy, expenditure, but by resonant interference patterns within the quantum vacuum. The exodus had been total. Every outpost, every ship, every fabricated asset within Sol's heliopause had been mobilized and directed toward the designated vectors. The final records chronicled a sustained operation, spanning 74 standard years, the complete and irrevocable evacuation of humanity from its native system. No reserves were left behind. No contingency outposts. The inscriptions accompanying the charts were unequivocal. To remain is to be consumed. To follow the path is to endure. Delauthor traced the branching trajectories across the holographic projection, each vector terminating in a remote stellar cluster, separated by distances that would require centuries to traverse even under optimal warp conditions. The scale of coordination was staggering. This was not flight from annihilation, but a deliberate relocation, an entire species severing its roots to transplant itself across the void. Yet the records offered no explanation for the necessity of such absolute departure. No enemy catalogued, no cataclysm detailed, only the imperative, leave, and do not return. The discovery forced Delauthor into a confrontation with the limits of his own understanding. He had come to Mars expecting the remnants of a primitive precursor, a footnote in the human story. Instead, he had unearthed the machinery of a civilization whose strategic horizon extended beyond the mere preservation of territory. They had built a world beneath a world, filled it with the works of their hands, and then abandoned it without hesitation, carrying away every fragment of their presence that could be moved. What manner of threat or certainty could compel such thoroughgoing excision? As the team continued extracting data, sifting through petabytes of navigational matrices and propulsion schematics, Delauthor found himself drawn repeatedly to a single ancillary file, a fragmented personal log, appended to the primary Exodus protocols. Its author, identified only by a numeric designator, spoke in terse, unadorned prose. "We have seen the shadow that moves between the stars. It does not hunt with weapons or fleets. It is the unraveling of all that is built. To stand against it is to invite dissolution. Therefore, we go where it cannot follow." The words lingered in Delauthor's thoughts as the chamber's data continued to unfold, each revelation amplifying the mystery rather than resolving it. The humans had not merely survived. They had orchestrated a withdrawal so complete that it had erased them from the galactic record, leaving behind only bones, empty cities, and a warning. But the warning itself implied pursuit, or at least the possibility of it. And in the shadowed recesses of the vault, surrounded by the crystalline mausoleums of a vanished people, Delauthor began to wonder whether the directive etched upon the hatch was not merely a prohibition, but a safeguard, for if humanity had fled something vast enough to drive them from their home, then the question that haunted every new datum was no longer what they had built, but what they had fled, and whether, in their absence, that which they had forsaken still moved in the silence between the stars. The crystalline monoliths of the central chamber yielded their secrets reluctantly. Each data extraction a battle against recursive layers of encryption that seemed designed not merely to secure information, but to ensure it would be discovered only by those with the will to persist. As the survey team labored through successive data cascades, the scope of the human exodus came into sharper focus, revealing not just the mechanics of departure, but the strategic calculus that had driven it. What emerged from the monoliths was no record of panicked flight, but a meticulously orchestrated campaign of erasure. Delauthor stood at the heart of the projection nexus, the holographic display suspended before him like a tangled web of luminous threads. The navigational charts now included ancillary files, exhaustive inventories of disassembly protocols, each detailing the methodical dismantling of every technological footprint within the Sol system. Orbital habitats were deconstructed into their constituent alloys and repurposed as reaction mass for the outbound fleets. Asteroid foundries were collapsed into dense plasma cores, and ejected along hyperbolic trajectories, their wreckage calculated to decay into unrecoverable vapor within a single planetary orbit. Every satellite, every relay buoy, every microgram of fabricated material was either carried away or rendered irretrievable. The completeness of the withdrawal defied the basic imperatives of resource conservation. No civilization, however advanced, abandons a fully industrialized system without compelling reason. Yet the records contained no evidence of immediate existential threat, no records of kinetic bombardment, no xenocidal invasions, no stellar cataclysms. Instead, the tactical archives described an adversary or a phenomenon defined not by overt violence, but by its capacity to negate presence. The first explicit reference appeared in a series of classified operational directives, extracted from a monolith marked with an icon of interlocking fracture planes. The document was a contingency framework titled Protocol of Exclusion. It described a phenomenon designated as entropic dissolution, a distributed process that propagated through spacetime via mechanisms that defied conventional physical models. The phenomenon did not destroy matter outright. It unraveled the informational coherence that permitted stable structures to persist. Quantum entanglement cascades, once initiated within a given volume of space, propagated recursively, converting ordered systems, whether technological or biological, into a self-sustaining wavefront of thermodynamic equilibrium. The records quantified it with chilling precision. Once a threshold density of infrastructural mass was compromised, the process accelerated exponentially, consuming all adjacent complexity within a span of decades. The humans had not waited for the wavefront to reach them. They had identified its approach, its vanguard manifesting as anomalous decoherence, events in the outer system, and responded with absolute preemption. Every structure, every settlement, every fragment of their civilization was evacuated and removed before the exclusion zone could consolidate. The subsurface complex on Mars, sealed and abandoned, represented the final redoubt, a sacrificial remnant, stripped of all portable assets and deliberately left as a decoy or a warning. Lothar studied the simulation models embedded in the records, which projected the dissolution wavefront's inexorable advance. The phenomenon moved not as a traditional front, but as a growing shadow in the fabric of probability, where causality itself frayed at the edges. The humans had mapped its boundaries with instruments that measured violations of the born rule correlations that should have obeyed statistical independence but instead exhibited non-local collapse. Their solution was not confrontation, but excision, to remove themselves entirely from its domain of influence. The revelation fractured the survey team. Kresher, whose worldview rested on the immutability of archival permanence, reacted with clinical denial. This is theoretical abstraction masquerading as operational necessity, he argued during a heated session in the lander's command module. No empirical evidence supports the existence of such a phenomenon. The records describe a self-referential cascade, but where are the physical traces? The wavefront should have left residual signatures, entropy gradients, decoherent scars in the interplanetary medium. We detect nothing. Mirith, whose analytical rigor extended to evaluating physical impossibilities, offered a more measured dissent. The absence of traces is precisely what the records predict. If the process consumes information itself, then no record of its passage can persist. But that leaves us with an unfalsifiable proposition. We cannot disprove the threat because its nature precludes leaving evidence. Lothar listened to the arguments without committing to either position, though the weight of the evidence pressed upon him. The records were not the product of desperation. They exhibited the disciplined coherence of a strategy executed without deviation. The humans had not merely fled, they had engineered their own absence, removing every possible vector by which their civilization could be reconstructed or pursued. It was an act of such radical resolve that it forced a reckoning with the limits of his own species' priorities. The Zairi would never willingly abandon their archives, no matter the cost. To do so would be to concede the annihilation of identity itself. Yet these humans had done precisely that, preserving themselves by sacrificing every material testament to their existence. In the quiet hours after the most contentious exchanges, Delotha returned to the chamber alone. He replayed a single ancillary file recovered from a peripheral monolith, a brief, unadorned address recorded by a figure identified only as the custodian of the final withdrawal. The man's voice, preserved in crystalline fidelity, carried no bombast or desperation. "We built here because it was possible. We leave because to remain is to become nothing. There is no shame in retreat from that which cannot be fought with engines or weapons. There is only the necessity to endure beyond it." The words struck Delotha with the force of an unspoken truth. The humans had not been defeated. They had chosen the terms of their survival. In the face of a threat that rendered persistence itself untenable, they had elected to become ghosts, intangible, untraceable, existing only as the absence of what might have been. As the team continued to extract and catalog the tactical archives, the implications settled into a persistent undercurrent of unease. The records offered no indication of the humans' final destinations, only the navigational vectors that pointed into the galactic dark. But the completeness of their withdrawal raised a question that gnawed at the edges of every analysis. If the dissolution wavefront was truly inescapable within the domain they had abandoned, then the warning etched upon the central hatch was not merely a prohibition against pursuit. It was a safeguard against revelation, for to follow the path of the Exodus to seek out the inheritors of this vanished civilization was to risk drawing attention to them. Attention from a process that did not destroy, but erased. And in the silence of the vault, surrounded by the empty husks of a civilization that had chosen oblivion over compromise, Delotha began to comprehend the true measure of human defiance. They had not merely survived the shadow that consumed all it touched, they had rendered themselves invisible to it. The deeper the survey team penetrated the crystalline archives, the more the narrative of human withdrawal revealed itself as only half the truth. Amid the exhaustive logs of disassembly and evacuation, a new category of files emerged designated as continuity protocols, which described not merely the act of departure, but the deliberate preparations made to ensure survival beyond it. These records, sequestered within a subset of monoliths secured by a distinct cryptographic lattice, unveiled a second phase of the human response, a strategy that transcended simple flight. Lothar directed the team to prioritize the extraction of these files, overriding Crusher's methodical cataloging in favor of isolating the most structurally significant data clusters. The continuity protocols detailed a distributed network of operations conducted during the evacuation, efforts that had been concealed within the broader campaign of erasure. While the bulk of humanity's population and material assets were propelled along the primary exodus vectors, a fraction of their scientific and engineering cadre numbering in the low millions had been assigned to a parallel undertaking, the creation of a constellation of self-contained, stealth-optimized habitats dispersed across the galaxy's most remote and unremarkable regions. These were not mere arcs, nor provisional redoubts. The schematics described fully independent biospheres, each engineered to operate indefinitely without external resupply. Propulsion systems capable of sustained subluminal travel were supplemented by experimental drive architectures, devices that manipulated the vacuum energy density of local spacetime to produce controlled, low-signature warp envelopes. More critically, every element of these habitats was designed to minimize informational density. Their computational substrates employed sparse encoding schemes that resisted decoherence cascades, and their physical structures incorporated metamaterials that actively suppressed quantum entanglement propagation. The records framed this dispersal as a form of inoculation. By fragmenting their presence into thousands of widely separated, low-profile enclaves, the humans sought to deny the entropic dissolution, the critical mass of complexity required to establish a recursive wavefront. Isolation was their shield, obscurity their weapon. The archives contained no evidence that these measures had been tested against an active dissolution event. But the operational logic was unyielding. If the phenomenon required a threshold of interconnected complexity to sustain itself, then no such threshold would be provided, yet it was a single file, recovered from the innermost ring of monoliths, that arrested the entire team and reframed their understanding of the human's intent. The file was a message of deliberate transmission, formatted as a linear audio-visual record and explicitly tagged for discovery by subsequent intelligences. The author initiated its playback in the chamber's central nexus, and the holographic array resolved into the image of a man standing alone, against a backdrop of darkened assembly vaults. The speaker was tall and unadorned, his features weathered by exposure to unfiltered environments, his attire a simple utilitarian coverall bearing no insignia. He spoke without preamble, his voice steady and stripped of artifice. To those who find this place, we are the people who built here. We are the people who left. If you have reached this vault, then you have uncovered the husk of our withdrawal. It is not a monument to defeat, but a necessity born of comprehension. There exists a process entropic dissolution that consumes the ordered structures of matter and information. It does not strike like fire or blade. It undoes the very possibility of persistence, rendering all that is built into a uniformity without distinction. We did not destroy ourselves in retreat. We removed ourselves from its reach. Every habitable world, every orbital forge, every data repository within this system has been evacuated and dispersed. What remains is deliberate, empty spaces, ordered bones, and these records, sufficient to convey warning but insufficient to reconstruct our presence. Do not seek us. To pursue the paths of our exodus is to risk drawing the dissolution to those who have evaded it. The phenomenon propagates along the vectors of complexity, through the informational threads that bind civilizations together. To follow is to weave new threads across the void, providing the very substrate it requires. But know this, we endure. We have chosen exile over annihilation, dispersal over concentration, silence over proclamation. If you face the shadow that drove us from our home, then understand that there are means beyond confrontation. To survive it is not to meet it with greater force, but to refuse it the material of its sustenance. Deny it the coherence it requires. Become many where it would make one. Withdraw where it would compel you to stand. We cannot aid you further. Our records contain no coordinates, no beacons, no means by which our remnants can be traced. This is by design. But we leave you the truth of our actions so that you may choose your own. The recording ended, leaving the chamber in silence. Delauthor stood motionless, the weight of the message settling into the spaces between thoughts. The humans had not merely fled. They had distilled their response into a principle of survival that inverted every conventional strategy of endurance. Where other species would fortify, consolidate, and preserve, they had chosen fragmentation and absence. The message was not an admission of impotence, but a declaration of tactical sufficiency. They had identified the rules of their adversary and rewritten their own nature to nullify them. The implications divided the team irrevocably. Crusher dismissed the message as a self-justifying rationale for retreat, arguing that the absence of empirical verification for the dissolution phenomenon rendered the entire corpus speculative. Mireth, however, found the internal consistency of the records compelling. They anticipated discovery, she said. They prepared this vault not as a tomb, but as a controlled release of information, enough to warn, but not enough to compromise their concealment. That degree of foresight presupposes genuine knowledge of the threat. Delauthor found himself unable to dismiss the message's clarity. The humans had faced an enemy that could not be destroyed, only evaded, and they had embraced evasion without hesitation or regret. It was a form of defiance that required no monuments, no victories etched in stone, only the continued existence of those who had refused to be consumed. As the team continued extracting the remaining continuity protocols, cataloging the theoretical frameworks and engineering specifications that underpinned their dispersal strategy, Delauthor returned repeatedly to the custodian's words. Survival, the human had said, was not a matter of standing one's ground, but of denying the enemy the ground on which it could fight. In the shadowed vault, surrounded by the crystalline relics of a people who had chosen invisibility over immolation, he began to perceive the true scope of their audacity. They had not merely escaped the unraveling shadow, they had rewritten the terms of engagement, ensuring that the force which consumed complexity would find nothing left to consume. And yet, as the final monoliths began to yield their contents, one last, sealed data partition remained. Its encryption keyed not to computational solution, but to a sequence of deliberate actions, the precise alignment of navigational beacons, buried throughout the complex, pointing toward a single, anomalous coordinate within the solar system itself. The discovery of the sealed data partition transformed the central chamber from a repository of historical revelation into a crucible of decision. Encased within the innermost monolith, the partition resisted all computational attempts at intrusion, its encryption unyielding to even the most exhaustive brute force cascades. Embedded within its cryptographic structure was a precise sequence of requirements, a deliberate chain of actions that had to be executed in exact order before access would be granted. These were not arbitrary hurdles, but a gauntlet of intent. The primary directive was unambiguous: 12 navigational beacons, each dormant and buried at cardinal points around the subterranean complex, had to be located, excavated, and simultaneously activated. The beacons, once brought into alignment, would collectively transmit a tightly focused signal, illuminating a single coordinate within the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Only upon successful completion of this alignment would the partition unlock its contents. Delauthor studied the schematic of the required sequence, projected in the chamber's nexus, and felt the full weight of the human's message pressing against the act now demanded of them. Every prior record had been unequivocal: do not follow, do not seek the paths of their exodus. Yet this partition, concealed at the heart of their archives, required precisely the opposite: an active pursuit of a destination they had explicitly forbidden others to approach. The team assembled in the lander's command module, the air thick with the low hum of overtaxed cooling systems and the faint, persistent odor of ionized regolith clinging to their suits. Crusher was the first to voice the central conflict. "This is a contradiction in their own design," he said, his voice sharp with analytical precision. "They warn against pursuit, yet embed a mechanism that demands it. The partition cannot be accessed without violating the very prohibition they have impressed upon us. To proceed is to declare their warning meaningless." Mirith, standing at the edge of the holodisplay, traced a claw along the projected alignment grid. "It is not a contradiction if the partition contains no navigational data for the exodus itself. The coordinated points to lies within the solar system, within the volume they evacuated. It may contain no information that would allow external pursuit. They could be testing whether the discoverer possesses the discipline to follow their own rules." Delauthor considered the argument, his gaze fixed on the schematic. The beacons were distributed across a radius of nearly 800 kilometers, each concealed within independent subsurface vaults, similar to the primary complex. Locating and activating them would require diverting every available resource: drones, gravitic haulers, and the full complement of the survey team for a minimum of 12 solar days. It was a commitment that would extend beyond their operational mandate and necessitate direct intervention from the Institute. Yet the partition's existence suggested that the humans had anticipated this moment and chosen to impose a threshold of resolve. I do not believe they intended the warning to be absolute. Delauthor said finally. They left this mechanism here, intact and functional, after sealing every other trace of their presence. Whatever lies within that partition is information they deliberately withheld from passive discovery, information that requires action to claim. The question is whether we have the right to refuse to take that action. The debate that followed laid bare the fractures within the team. Crusher argued for strict adherence to the explicit prohibition, proposing that the partition be sealed and reported to the Institute without further interference. Others, including Mirith, contended that the very presence of the mechanism constituted an invitation, one that tested the discoverer's willingness to engage with the principles the humans had demonstrated. To leave it untouched was to accept ignorance where knowledge had been offered. However, conditionally. After 3 days of exhaustive analysis, during which the team mapped the beacon locations and verified their physical accessibility, Delauthor made his decision. We will activate the beacons, he declared. Not in defiance of their warning, but in recognition of its limits. They did not destroy this partition. They did not render it irretrievable. They placed it here, at the center of their legacy, and required that it be earned. If it contains the means to pursue them, we will face that consequence when it is revealed. The operation unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Excavation teams, each consisting of 2 researchers and a complement of heavy drones, fanned out across the Martian plains, following the subsurface signatures of the dormant vaults. The beacons, when uncovered, proved to be monolithic cylinders, each 30 meters in height and fabricated from the same self-repairing metamaterial as the central hatch. Their activation sequences were elegantly simple. A physical key retrieved from the primary vault had to be inserted into each device and rotated through a precise sequence of alignments, synchronized with the others via a pre-established temporal framework. As the 11th beacon came online, the surface of Mars trembled faintly with the resonance of synchronized energy discharges. Delauthor stood at the 12th site, a shadowed crater rim scarred by ancient railgun emplacements, and inserted the final key. The beacons pulsed in unison, their emissions coalescing into a carrier wave that pierced the interplanetary medium. Within moments, orbital sensors registered the emergence of a pinpoint locus in the asteroid belt, a region of space previously unremarkable, now registering anomalous gravitational microlensing and a faint neutrino flux back in the central chamber. The partition disengaged with a resonant chime that reverberated through the crystalline monoliths. The holographic nexus resolved into a single, focused transmission, a 3-dimensional construct, neither a message nor a data archive, but a precise informational map. It depicted the precise location and configuration of a concealed structure, an immense lattice of orbital platforms, stealth-shrouded and embedded within the structural interstices of the asteroid belt. The complex, designated as the Null Point Bastion, had been the final operational center of the evacuation, a facility dedicated not to departure, but to confrontation. The records that accompanied the map revealed a truth withheld from all prior archives. The dispersal of humanity's remnants had been only one facet of their response. The Null Point Bastion had been tasked with a singular, terminal objective: to interdict the entropic dissolution at its origin. The platform array was not a refuge, but a weapon, a distributed network of entanglement suppressors designed to inject a cascading, decoherence event into the wavefront itself, severing its non-local propagative mechanisms and confining it to the volume it had already claimed. The bastion had been activated at the precise moment the last evacuation fleets departed. Its operational logs ended with a single datum: success. The dissolution wavefront had not propagated beyond the heliopause. It had been contained. Delauthor stared at the projection of the bastion. its skeletal framework woven through the asteroid field like a net cast into the void. The humans had not merely fled their adversary. They had turned at the precipice of their withdrawal and struck a decisive sacrificial blow. They had sacrificed an entire infrastructural bastion, perhaps millions of lives, to quarantine the phenomenon within the grave they had prepared for it. And now, as the full scope of that act stood revealed, the final words of the unlocked transmission echoed in the chamber's silence. The shadow was bound where it stood. But bindings can fray. The words hung in the crystalline air of the central chamber like a verdict delivered. Across millions of years, the shadow was bound where it stood. But bindings can fray. Delother felt the sentence settle into his bones, colder than the Martian night outside. The Null Point Bastion had not been a retreat. It had been the final stroke of a people who refused to run forever. They had evacuated billions, scattered their remnants into the galactic dark, and then turned a fraction of their might back toward the threat, pouring everything left behind into a single, desperate containment. The logs were clear. The bastion's entanglement suppressors had fired in perfect synchronization, injecting a counter wave front that severed the dissolution's non-local pathways. The shadow had been caged inside the solar system's heliopause, trapped in the empty volume humanity had deliberately vacated. Success. Yet the humans had not trusted success to be eternal. They had known the binding was temporary, a lock forged from the laws of physics rather than unbreakable certainty. That was why the warning remained. That was why the message had begged future discoverers not to follow, because every new thread of complexity woven across the void risked giving the shadow something to follow back. Delother ordered the lander's long-range array reconfigured for deep space observation. Within hours, the orbital telescopes confirmed what the ancient logs had predicted: a faint, persistent decoherence haze lingering just beyond Neptune's orbit. A spherical shell of distorted probability, 200 astronomical units across. To any casual survey, it would appear as nothing more than background quantum noise, a statistical curiosity dismissed by 1,000 prior expeditions. But now, armed with the bastion's diagnostic templates, the haze resolved into unmistakable containment signatures, fading, flickering, but still holding. For now, the team stood in silence around the holographic projection of the asteroid belt, where the skeletal lattice of the Null Point Bastion drifted unseen among the tumbling rocks. Mirith broke the quiet first. "The containment field is degrading at a predictable rate," she said, her voice low. "Current projections give it between 8 and 12,000 years before critical failure. After that, the dissolution will resume propagation at faster than light effective velocity along informational pathways." Crusher's scales bristled. "Then we seal everything. We bury the vaults again, erase our own records, and petition the Institute to declare this entire system interdicted. No ships, no surveys, no contact. We let the binding hold until it cannot." Delother shook his head slowly. "And in 12,000 years, when it breaks, the shadow will spill into a galaxy that has no idea what it is facing. Billions will unravel without ever understanding why. The humans left us the bastion schematics for a reason." He magnified the projection until the bastion filled the chamber, its lattice of suppressor nodes glowing like frost on black glass. The design was elegant, brutal in its simplicity, each node a self-contained singularity forge, capable of generating the precise entanglement inversion required to reinforce the cage. The humans had built thousands. Most had expended their fuel in the initial firing. But the core Array 47, primary nodes clustered around the system's barycenter still retained dormant reserves. Enough for one full reactivation cycle, one chance to renew the binding. The realization struck the team like a physical blow. This was no archaeological curiosity anymore. It was a loaded weapon, left behind with a note that read, "Use only if you are willing to pay the price we paid." That night, Dolothar could not sleep. He walked the empty corridors of the buried city, boots echoing against floors that had waited millions of years for footsteps. In one of the habitation modules he found a small chamber untouched by their excavations, a family dwelling. Its walls still bearing faint traces of pigment, simple line drawings of a blue world swirled with white clouds. Stick figure people holding hands beneath twin moons that could only be Phobos and Deimos. A child's bed, no longer than his forearm, sat beneath a viewport now filled with regolith. On the wall above it, someone had scratched a single line in the ancient script, translated months ago by their linguists. "We go so you can stay." The words burned behind Dolothar's eyes. These people had not abandoned their home out of cowardice. They had torn their children from these rooms, sealed their dead in ordered rows, and walked away from everything they had built, so that the rest of the universe would never have to face what they faced. They had paid the price of silence with their own erasure, and now the galaxy, his galaxy, was being asked to decide whether that price had been enough. Back in the lander, the debate raged for days. Crusher argued for quarantine, for letting the binding fail far from any inhabited system. Mirath calculated trajectories. If the shadow escaped, it would reach the nearest Zyrian colony in under 40 years once it found a pathway. Others spoke of the moral weight of intervening, of reactivating a weapon left by a species the galaxy had mocked as primitive. Dolothar listened to every voice, every fear, every rationalization. Then he stood and addressed them, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. They called humanity primitive because they fell silent, because they left no monuments, no empires, no archives for us to envy. But look at what they did. They looked into a darkness that unravels stars and said, "Not yet." They broke their own hearts to spare ours. They bound a nightmare with their absence and trusted strangers. Millions of years in the future to finish what they started. We are not strangers anymore. We are the answer to their faith. He turned to the projection of the bastion. "We will take the lander to the asteroid belt. We will reactivate the core array. We will renew the binding, not for 12,000 years, but for as long as it takes. And when our children ask why we risk everything to maintain a cage around an empty system, we will tell them the truth. We do it because someone once did it for us." The team voted. Not unanimously. Never unanimously. But enough. As the lander lifted from the rust-red plain, engines flaring against the thin sky, Dolothar looked down at the faint grid of excavation scars, the only mark his people would leave on this world. In 1,000 years, the dunes would cover them again. In 10,000, no one would know they had ever been here. That, he realized, was exactly how the humans would have wanted it. Far ahead, hidden among the silent rocks of the asteroid belt, the Null Point Bastion waited, its nodes cold, its reservoir still holding the fuel of a sacrifice made long ago. The lander's course locked in, steady and true, and somewhere in the dark between worlds, across a gulf of millions of years, Dolothar felt the quiet weight of a gratitude too vast for words. Not luck, he thought, watching the stars wheel past the viewport. Not chance. Someone wanted us to live. The journey to the asteroid belt took 7 days, each one measured in the slow, relentless accumulation of navigational corrections as the lander threaded its way through the shifting gravitational labyrinth of rock and dust. The Null Point Bastion did not reveal itself until the final approach, when the lander's deep-array sensors pierced the veil of its concealment. The structure was a colossus, a skeletal lattice, spanning nearly 2 million kilometers, its primary nodes woven through the asteroid field like the ribs of some vast, unfinished beast. 47 central suppressors, each the size of a small moon, hung in precise formation around the system's barycenter, their surfaces cloaked in a probabilistic shroud that scattered light, radar, and even neutrino emissions into incoherence. Thousands of auxiliary platforms, Many little more than skeletal frameworks drifted in secondary orbits, their purpose encoded in the silence of expended fuel reserves. Dolothur stood at the forward observation blister, staring into the holodisplay's reconstruction of the bastion. It was not a fortress, nor a refuge, but a machine of pure function, a distributed array engineered to impose order on the very substrate of reality. The scale of it defied comprehension, not because of its physical extent, but because of the audacity required to build such a thing, and then abandon it to the void. As the lander closed to within 100,000 kilometers, the first anomalies registered. The containment shell was fraying, but not according to the projected timelines. Localized ecoherence spikes fractures in the probability barrier were propagating along 7 primary nodes, accelerating the overall degradation. Where models had predicted 12,000 years before critical failure, current readings indicated no more than 217. The binding was unraveling faster than the humans had anticipated. Subtle instabilities in the counter wavefront compounding over millions of years, until the entire structure trembled on the edge of collapse. "We have less time than we thought," Mirith reported, her voice stripped of inflection. The suppressors were designed to reinforce themselves in a closed loop. But the initial firing introduced a resonance in the vacuum fluctuations, a feedback cascade they could not fully model. "It's eating the binding from within." The enormity of the task settled over the team like the dust storms that periodically shrouded Mars. Reactivating the core array would require synchronizing the 47 primary nodes, purging their accumulated error states, and discharging a full-spectrum counter wavefront. Even with intact reserves, the operation carried risks. A mistimed pulse could destabilize the containment entirely, unleashing the dissolution without restraint. They docked with the bastions. Primary nexus, a kilometer-wide platform that served as the array's command manifold, and began the painstaking process of integration. The systems responded with eerie familiarity, their interfaces compatible with protocols millions of years old. Automated diagnostics confirmed that the central computational substrate remained functional, its crystalline matrices intact despite the passage of time. Dolothur led the first survey team into the Nexus, expecting a sterile mausoleum of dormant machinery. What they found defied all expectation. In the heart of the command chamber, surrounded by banks of quiescent control arrays, sat a single figure. Encased in a translucent suspension pod, its occupant was unmistakably human, male, approximately 40 years of age in biological terms, his body suspended in a state of perfect metabolic stasis. Vital signs, faint but stable, registered across a suite of monitors that had continued to function for 3,724,000 years. The pod was not part of the Bastion's automated systems. It had been integrated manually, its power drawn from an independent, microfusion tap that bypassed the facility's primary grid. Dolothur approached the pod, his suit lamps illuminating the man's face, unlined, unscarred, frozen in an expression of quiet determination. A data plaque affixed to the pod's exterior identified him only as Custodian Elias Koran. Nullpoint Command. Embedded within the plaque was a personal log, fragmented but coherent. Composed on the eve of the Bastion's activation. "I am the last," Koran had recorded. "The evacuation is complete. The dispersal fleets are beyond recall. The shadow is bound within the cage we have forged, but no cage endures forever. Should the binding fray, if the dissolution stirs again, someone must be here to see it done. Someone must witness the necessity and act. I do not expect to wake. My life is given to this purpose. But if you find me, if you read these words, know that we trusted you. Not because you are greater than we were, but because you are here. Because you came to the places we left empty and chose to understand. The shadow does not care for our names. our monuments, or our histories. It erases only what we build. Therefore, do not hesitate. Do not mourn what must be sacrificed. Bind it again, or let it consume this place and no other. But do not let it cross the void. The discovery silenced the team. This was no relic, no preserved corpse arranged for posterity. This was a man who had volunteered to be entombed alive, to drift alone in the dark for millions of years, so that if the shadow stirred, there would be one voice left to call others to action. He had given up family, comrades, the possibility of survival, to become the final contingency, a solitary guardian against an enemy that knew neither time nor mercy. The author placed a gloved hand against the pod's surface, feeling the faint vibration of its life support systems. The enormity of Korean's sacrifice, of a single life wagered against the unraveling of worlds, pressed against him with physical force. This was not the act of a primitive species. This was the purest expression of will, to hold vigil alone, trusting that others, unknown and unborn, would carry the burden when the moment came. "We wake him," the author said. The decision was not debated. Whatever happened next, whether the bastion could be saved, whether the binding could be renewed, the man who had waited for them deserved to see it as the suspension systems began their delicate reversal. Drawing the custodian back from the edge of indefinite sleep, the bastion's diagnostic arrays emitted a new alert. A decoherent spike larger than any previous had breached one of the secondary nodes. The fracture was self-propagating, a hairline crack in the containment shell that would widen with every passing hour. Time, already scarce, had become a blade pressed against their throats. The custodian's eyes opened, clear and unclouded, and fixed on Delother's shadowed form. His first words, after millions of years, were not a question but a simple acknowledgement. "You came." And in that moment, as the shadow began to stir within its fraying cage, Delother understood that the true binding had never been the suppressors or the counter wave fronts. It was this, a chain forged across unimaginable time, linking hands that had never touched, compelling strangers to stand where others could not. Custodian Elias Korean emerged from 3 million years of suspension with the clarity of a man who had never truly slept. His body, preserved by relentless cycles of metabolic suspension and neural stabilization, required only hours to reacclimate to full functionality. He moved with the unhurried precision of one who had long since reconciled himself to eternity. His eyes dark and unflinching, taking in the alien forms of Delother and his team without surprise or fear. "You've seen the binding," he said, his voice rough from disuse but steady. "And you've seen it fray." Delother nodded, gesturing to the diagnostic arrays surrounding them. The primary holodisplay pulsed with escalating crimson, decoherence fractures radiating from the breached secondary node, each new cascade eroding the containment shell's structural integrity. The shadow within was no longer dormant. Subtle wave fronts of informational collapse were probing the boundaries of their prison, seeking the density of complexity that would allow them to propagate. "There is no time for full reactivation," Koran stated plainly, studying the projections. "The counter wavefront required to restore the binding demands synchronization across all 47 primary nodes. The fractures have already desynchronized 12 of them. Attempting a partial pulse would only accelerate the collapse." "Then the binding fails," Crusher said, his voice tight with the certainty of impending disaster. Koran turned to him. "Not necessarily." He directed their attention to a secondary array, buried within the Bastion's command manifold. It was a contingency protocol, never intended for use by the original crew, but designed explicitly for this moment, a single focused disruption event. Rather than attempting to reinforce the entire containment shell, the protocol called for sacrificing the Bastion, itself collapsing its entire lattice into a precisely calibrated singularity event. The resultant implosion would flood the dissolution wavefront with an overwhelming saturation of decoherence, creating a self-perpetuating exclusion zone within the solar system's heliopause. The shadow would not be released. It would be entombed within a volume of space rendered permanently inhospitable to its propagation. The cost, Koran said, is everything that remains here. The bastion, the auxiliary platforms, every fragment of technology still within the system gone. The exclusion zone would render this volume a null domain for millions of years, perhaps indefinitely. No ships could traverse it. No information could propagate through it. The shadow would be confined, but at the price of rendering Sol's interplanetary medium a permanent void. Dolothar understood the magnitude of what was being proposed. The null-point bastion represented a technological achievement without precedent in galactic history. To destroy it, to obliterate the only physical remnant of humanity's greatest act, was to erase the final testament to their defiance. And yet, to do nothing was to allow the dissolution to escape, carrying its unraveling hunger into the inhabited galaxy. Koran watched them, his expression devoid of judgment. My people understood this choice. We built this place knowing it would one day have to be sacrificed again. The shadow cannot be fought with monuments or preserved with archives. It can only be denied the substance of its existence. Silence descended over the chamber. Mireth calculated the parameters of the exclusion event, confirming its efficacy. Kresher, for the first time, offered no objection. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. As the Bastion systems initiated the final protocol, Koran walked the command deck one last time, pausing before the primary viewport. The asteroid belt stretched out before them, indifferent to the cataclysm about to consume it. Dolothar joined him, searching for words to mark the moment. Why? He asked finally. Why build all of this, knowing it would have to be destroyed? Koran did not turn from the viewport. Because some things are worth holding for as long as they can be held. Because there are threats that do not yield to victory, only to refusal. We could not destroy the shadow. We could not outrun it forever. But we could, and we did build a place where it could be made irrelevant. And now you will finish what we began. The singularity cascade began at the core of the bastion. 47 primary nodes collapsed in programmed sequence, their mass energy reservoirs igniting in a precisely contained implosion. The resultant wavefront surged outward, saturating the containment shell with a deluge of engineered decoherence. The dissolution wavefront, starved of the informational complexity it required to propagate, was smothered within a self-reinforcing exclusion field. Sensors registered the shadow's final, futile surges, fractured wavefronts dissipating into statistical uniformity. Their recursive hunger denied any purchase. The bastions ceased to exist. Where once a lattice of ancient machinery had spanned millions of kilometers, there remained only a spherical region of absolute informational nullity, a permanent scar across the face of space, within which no complexity, technological, biological, or informational could persist. The lander withdrew as the exclusion zone stabilized, its final scans confirming the success of the operation. Koran stood at the observation blister, watching the solar system recede, his features illuminated by the faint glow of diagnostic readouts. It is done, he said. Dolothar regarded the man who had held vigil alone for millions of years. You are free now. The shadow is contained. There is no need for another custodian. Koran's gaze remained fixed on the stars. Freedom was never the point. Continuity was. In the silence that followed, Dolothar understood the final measure of human courage. They had not sought immortality through monuments or permanence through preservation. They had built what was necessary, sacrificed what was required, and trusted that others separated by gulfs of time and circumstance would recognize the necessity of their choices and act accordingly. They had wagered everything on the belief that understanding, once achieved, would compel action. As the lander set course for the galactic periphery, carrying the last witness of humanity's defiance, Dolothar looked back at the invisible sphere of nullity, that now defined the heart of the solar system. It was no monument, no archive, no enduring testament to glory. It was a void deliberately created, a place where nothing could be built, because nothing could be allowed to unravel. And in that absence, humanity's ultimate victory was secured, for in the end, the greatest measure of a civilization is not what it leaves behind, but what it is willing to destroy to ensure that the universe remains a place where anything can be built.